She was sold for not bearing children. In the late autumn of 1871, beneath a red sky heavy with dust, a woman stepped down from a wagon with her wrists still raw from rope. Her name was Ada, though no one in Black Hollow used it. They called her the Quiet One, the Barren, or simply turned away when she passed. A childless wife was no wife at all in the Dakota frontier, and to her husband, she became a burden to trade, not bury. He handed her off for 2 sacks of grain, a jug of whiskey, and a saddle in need of stitching. The man who took her wasn't cruel, just empty-eyed, like something in him had frozen long ago. He dropped her at a crooked barn on the edge of town, told her she could sweep, keep quiet, and not touch the horses. She did all 3 that winter. Ada spoke no words. She walked the cold earth barefoot most days, as if punishing her own silence. The other women at the mill turned their backs when she passed. The preacher's wife left used candles at her doorstep, half kind, half pitiful. Ada lit them anyway. By spring, even the dogs stopped barking at her. Then came the Lakota. He rode in at dusk, alone but not afraid, his hair braided with red thread in dust from the plains. His horse was lean and tired, but his eyes were wide, open, scanning the horizon like he'd seen too much and was still seeing it. He passed through Black Hollow without speaking. People whispered, some laughed. But no one stopped him, except her. She was walking back from the creek, her skirt soaked at the hem, when their paths crossed near the poplar grove. He didn't slow his horse, didn't greet her. But he looked at her, just once, long enough for something to shift inside her chest. A thing she'd buried with the hope of motherhood. The next day, he came again. He spoke to no one, but walked straight to the barn where Ada kept to the shadows. The stable hand watched, spitting tobacco, as the Lakota placed a wrapped bundle on the step. Bread, beans, a piece of folded buckskin. Then he walked away. She didn't touch the bundle until nightfall. When she did, her hands trembled. 3 weeks passed before he spoke to her. He found her in the garden behind the barn, tearing weeds from the cracked soil with her bare hands. He crouched beside her, silent for a while. Then, in a voice carved, "Like wind through stone," he said, "you do not bloom, but still you feed the ground." She didn't reply. The next morning, a child's rattle carved from bone appeared on her windowsill. By summer, the town was watching her hang laundry with steadier hands, watching him fix the corral fence without ever asking for coin. Some said he was soft in the head. Others said he was only waiting to steal a horse or worse. But Ada knew. She saw the way he touched the land, not to take, but to remember. She watched his hands when he mended her roof, how he never wasted emotion, never raised his voice to the nails or the wind. One evening, as the sun melted into gold behind the hills, she asked him why he kept coming back. He didn't answer right away. Then he looked toward the barn where she slept and said, "Because my future lives in you." She blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. But he had already walked away, his footsteps quiet as dusk. From that day on, she swept the barn as if it were a home, planted seeds she didn't know the names of, waited for rain with her palms open. She had been traded like a mule for not giving life, and yet here he was, carving hope from her silence. The days grew long, though she still woke before the sun, her breath clouding in the chill of dawn. Ada moved through the barn like a shadow, her hands calloused but graceful. She never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, her words were few, chosen like stones smoothed by water. Inside, she kept a small corner behind the feed sacks where she'd placed a folded wool blanket and a tin cup that once held a single sunflower. The flower had dried weeks ago, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it out. It stood there like a monument to something too faint to name. The townsfolk gave her space, not out of respect, but unease. The widow Clemens crossed the street when Ada approached, murmuring about curses and barrenness. The children mimicked. Her limp when they thought she wasn't looking, but Ada had long stopped waiting for kindness. She'd once been a wife, not unhappily, but with expectation clinging to every corner of the home. Expectation for laughter, for a crib, for the cries. That never came. Month after month, her husband's eyes grew narrower, like looking at her caused pain. By the third winter, he drank more than he worked. By the fourth, he sold her to a rancher passing through, and didn't even watch her leave. She never cried in front of them. Not the townsfolk, not the new man, not even God. But sometimes at night, she would touch her belly, thin and unmarked, and whisper the names she once held in her mouth, like promises. Names for daughters she never met, for sons she never carried. She said them softly, like prayers folded into hay, and then came the Lakota. His name, she later learned, was Silas, though he rarely spoke it himself. He'd once fought beside the Union men at Fort Rice, then rode west when the treaties broke like dry bark under boots. He didn't say much about his people or the river valley he left behind, only that he came where the wind told him. And lately, the wind stayed near her when he was near. She felt less like a ghost. He would hand her tools without a word, nod once in thanks if she patched a fence before he did. They rarely looked at each other directly, but something passed between them in the pauses, the kind of silence that doesn't weigh you down, but carries you. One morning, she watched him teaching a stray dog to trust again. The animal had a twisted leg, same as the child she saw limping near the church sometimes, and Silas held out meat without chasing or coaxing. Just waited. Hands steady, breath even, Ada stood in the barn doorway, not moving, as if any sound might shatter the fragile peace that surrounded him. That evening, he brought her a carved comb, made of birch and worn smooth at the teeth. For the wind, he said simply, then walked away. She brushed her hair that night for the first time in months, watched the strands fall like threads of shadow onto the floor. She didn't cry, not from sadness, but because the gesture itself had undone something tight around her ribs. No one had given her something for no reason in a long, long time. Still, she remained careful. She'd learned that affection could turn sharp, could vanish. She remembered the way her name sounded through clenched teeth, the way her husband had said useless like a final verdict, but Silas never asked anything of her. He didn't touch her, unless she reached for something and his hand brushed hers. And even then, he withdrew like a man afraid of breaking a bird's wing. Some nights, he built a small fire outside the barn and just sat there, watching the stars. She'd peek through the slats, watching him. Once, she stepped outside and sat beside him, neither speaking. The fire popped and crackled. He poured her some coffee, thick and bitter, and she drank it like medicine. In that silence, something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but the recognition of another broken thing, gently. Being seen, Silas rarely spoke of the war. When he did, it was never in words shaped by glory or hatred. Just fragments. A river that ran red in Missouri. The way frost clung to a dying man's eyelashes. How silence sometimes followed the gunfire longer than the sound itself. Ada listened. Without asking questions, she understood that some wounds did not bleed, but spread quiet through a man's bones. That his calm was not peace, but something worn, like a path walked so many times it forgot where it began. The townsfolk still watched, them with side eyes and whispers. Savage lover, some muttered. Witch woman, Others hissed when they passed too close. But they kept their distance. Maybe it was Silas's gaze, not cruel, but unblinking, like a hawk that's seen too much sky to fear the crows below. He moved into a shack beyond the tree line, close enough for her to see the lantern at night through the barn's cracks. It flickered like a second heartbeat. He never said he was staying, never asked her to follow, but every morning she found something near the barn door: a carved spoon, a sprig of juniper, a piece of flint. Little offerings quiet as breath. She began to leave things in return: a folded handkerchief, a loaf of hard bread, once even a feather she found in the grass. Nothing spoken, just the language of two people who no longer trusted words. One afternoon, a storm rolled in heavy and sudden, slapping the plains with sheets of rain. She was gathering clothes from the line when her leg gave out in the mud. The pain shot up her spine like a whip. He was there before she could call out, lifting her without a word, arms steady, eyes fixed forward. She clung to his shirt, smelling leather and cedar and rain. He didn't speak as he carried her into the barn, set her gently on the hay, then crouched beside her, like he was waiting for permission to stay. She nodded once. That was enough. He tended to her ankle with hands that knew damage, slow, careful, respectful. And when the pain made her wince, he placed a hand on her shoulder. Just there. Nothing more. That night, he didn't leave. He built a fire just outside. The barn doors, close enough that its warmth found her through the boards. She lay on her side, eyes open to the flicker of light, and for the first time in years, felt unafraid to sleep. In the morning, she found a new beam nailed across the roof where rain had always leaked. She hadn't asked, but he knew. He began working the land behind the barn, quiet and tireless, turning soil, planting rows, using the bent tools others had discarded. He moved like someone building not just a garden, but a reason to stay, and slowly the space between them filled with gestures, a nod, a shared meal, a quiet glance during sunset. He never called her by name, but when their eyes met, she felt seen, not for her past or what she could not give, but for what she endured, what she still was. One morning, she found him sitting at the edge of the field, watching the horizon, with a stillness that made the world around him feel louder. She sat beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. "I used to be someone's husband," she said, voice low, unsure if she wanted him to hear. "I used to be someone's son," he replied. After a long pause, the wind moved through the grass. Neither of them spoke again for a while. But something shifted that morning, a thread tied between two souls who had both been left behind, both chosen silence over begging, and now they had started to speak again, not in sentences, but in presence. Spring softened into early summer, and the land responded in quiet praise. The soil, once brittle with frost, now gave way under Silas's boots, rich and damp. Rows of beans and squash began to push through, green fingers reaching for a sky that no longer threatened. Ada tended the garden in silence. She learned the rhythm of things, when to water, when to wait. She'd once thought herself incapable of nurturing life. But now the sprouts bent toward her hands like they knew her sorrow and welcomed it. Their days followed a pattern, quiet but full. She mended clothes, repaired broken hinges, learned the sound of approaching rain. Silas rose early, often already outside when she stepped into the dawn light. He never startled the birds, never disturbed the peace. His presence was like the hills, steady, even when unseen. They rarely shared meals inside. Instead, he'd build a small fire near the shed, and they'd eat with the wind brushing their shoulders. Salted meat, boiled potatoes, coffee brewed thick enough to chew. Sometimes she'd hum an old tune from her childhood, not realizing until he stopped chewing and tilted his head. "You sang that yesterday," he said once. "No," she replied. "That was the wind." He gave a half smile, soft and gone too quick. She began to notice his hands more, the scars, the calluses, how his knuckles sometimes ached when he clenched them. One evening, as he rubbed his wrist by the fire, she reached out and took his hand in hers. She didn't speak, just ran her fingers over the old wounds as if reading a language no longer spoken. He didn't pull away. Some nights, she found herself standing at the barn door long after dark, waiting for his lantern to appear through the trees. When it did, her chest loosened, just enough to breathe deeper. And once, when the lantern didn't light until late, she felt a strange panic rise, not from fear, but the sudden ache of what might be lost again. The town didn't say much anymore. Some folks muttered, others kept their distance. But the distance was no longer sharp. It dulled, like something they'd resigned to, or perhaps something they quietly began to respect. A girl from the mill once approached Ada near the creek, offered her a handful of wildflowers without a word. Ada took them, held them to her nose, and for the first time in years, smiled where someone could see. She still didn't speak much, but the lines around her mouth began to soften. Her gaze no longer stayed downcast. Silas noticed. He didn't comment. He simply moved through their shared world like someone content to witness, not possess. One evening, thunder rolled low across the prairie. Ada stood outside the barn, watching the sky flicker in the distance. Silas joined her, carrying 2 blankets. "Storm's not close," he said. "I know," she replied. He draped one blanket over her shoulders and stayed beside her as the wind picked up, sweet with the scent of rain and crushed grass. They watched together until the horizon swallowed the last light. In the barn, she sat near the oil lamp, mending a tear in his coat. When he stepped inside, he didn't speak, just knelt beside her, the flickering flame casting shadows across his face. She finished the last stitch, then held the coat to his chest. He didn't take it. Instead, he reached up and touched the side of her face, not with desire, but reverence. A slow brush of thumb against cheekbone, as if checking if she was real. If this moment was real, Ada didn't move, didn't blink, because, for the first time, she felt it, not just safety, but the beginning of belonging. A fragile, beautiful terror, and she let it settle inside her. The peace did not last. Late one morning, as the sun sat high and harsh over the plains, a rider approached. His horse was lean but fast, and dust clung to him like a second skin. Ada was hanging linens behind the barn when she saw him. The gait, the hat, the slouched shoulders. Her hands froze mid-motion. She recognized the man before he even spoke, Caleb Turner, her husband's cousin, though blood meant nothing between them but debt and history. He'd come from Dry Bluff once, years ago, when her belly still held hope. He had eyes like barbed wire and a voice that smelled of whiskey and bad news. Now he stood at the edge of the field, chewing on a splinter and squinting at her, as if inspecting a horse too old to sell. "Well," he said, "ain't this a picture?" Ada didn't move, didn't speak. He slid off the horse and tossed the reins to the ground like a threat. "Your man says you're still his," Caleb said, circling slowly. "Says you were loaned, not left. Figures he ought to get paid proper for what's his." She kept her hands low, the wet cloth dripping between her fingers. "He ain't my anything," she said. Caleb grinned, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, he don't see it that way. And he ain't the only one wondering why you're living out here with a redskin, planting beans like some preacher's wife." Ada's pulse climbed like fire up dry wood. But she stood still, chin high. Silas wasn't back yet. He'd ridden south that morning to trade for flour and new nails. She was alone. Caleb stepped closer. Heard there's money coming to this land soon. Railroad wants to buy through here. That true? She didn't answer. He leaned in, voice low and thick. You tell your Indian friend he's trespassing. Ain't no place for ghosts out here. Especially not his kind. And then he spat near her feet and rode off, kicking dust in her eyes. When Silas returned that evening, she didn't speak right away. She watched him tie the horse, unload supplies, brush the sweat from his brow. Then she told him he didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice or clench his fists. But his stillness changed, became tighter, like the calm before lightning strikes. He'll come back, she said. With others maybe. Silas nodded once. That night, he didn't build a fire. Instead, he sat inside the barn with her, both of them on opposite sides of the lamp. The air felt thinner, the silence heavier. Ada traced patterns in the hay with her fingers. He wants to sell me again, she said, not looking up. He won't, Silas replied. Why are you so sure? He looked at her then, eyes shadowed but steady. Because I have already lost too much to men who take. His words landed like stones on still water. The next day, Silas rode into town. Not with rage, but with purpose. Ada stayed behind, watching the wind roll through the wheat they'd planted. She knew what it meant. Knew that if he stepped too far, if he raised his voice or hand in a place like Black Hollow, they'd use it against him. Call him savage, violent, justify the rope. They always kept just out of sight, but he returned before sunset. Quiet, unharmed. They know now, he said. Who you are, and who I am, she nodded. She didn't ask what he'd said or to whom. The next week, the fields were watched. Riders appeared in the distance, sometimes Caleb, sometimes others. Eyes like dogs who'd caught the scent of meat, but hadn't yet decided to bite. Silas began keeping his rifle closer, though he never carried it into town. He taught Ada how to load it, how to breathe before pulling the trigger. She hated the weight of it in her hands, hated what it said about hope, but she learned, because sometimes love means planting, and sometimes it means guarding what you planted. They came at dawn, 3 men, not 4 as Ada feared, but armed and loud and certain of their purpose. Caleb rode at the front, reins loose, rifle slung across his chest, like an afterthought. Behind him, 2 others she didn't recognize, one with a split lip, the other young and twitching with the false confidence of a man who'd never bled for what he wanted. The dogs barked before the men reached the barn, but Silas was already outside. He stood in the field, axe in hand, though not raised. Ada stepped beside him, silent as always, her dress soaked at the hem from morning dew. The earth smelled of rain and old roots. Well now, Caleb called out, halting his horse. Looks like the rumors are true. She does obey. Silas didn't respond, came to settle a matter of property. Caleb continued, eyes shifting to Ada. She's spoken for, promised and unpaid. You don't want the law called in, friend. Silas turned his head slightly, just enough for Ada to see the tension in his jaw. No man owns her, he said. Not anymore, Caleb laughed, dismounting with a grunt. See, that's where you're wrong. What you've got here is stolen goods. Ada stepped forward then. Not behind Silas, not I was sold, she said, like a mule, left with rope burns and no name. That man, she pointed at Caleb, never asked if I wanted to live. Only if I could carry sons. The split-lipped man chuckled. Well, can you? Silas raised the axe then, not as a threat, but as a finality. "Ask again," he said. The young one shifted in his saddle. "We ain't looking for blood, then ride." Silas cut in, but Caleb was already walking toward Ada, slow and sure, as if nothing had changed. "You think this red bastard can protect you? He can't even stand in church. You think he'll keep you safe when the railroad buys this land and folks like him are chased into the dirt?" "I don't need to be protected," she said. "I just want to be left whole." Caleb spat, close this time, just like before. But as he moved to grab her arm, Silas stepped between them, swift as shadow. He didn't swing the axe, just shoved him back. With the flat of his palm, Caleb fell. Hard, the younger man reached for his rifle, but Ada was faster. She didn't aim it like a soldier, but she held it like truth, barrel raised, feet steady. Her hands didn't shake. "Leave," she said. "Before what's broken becomes buried." They did, not quickly, not without insults or threats. But they left, and the field grew quiet again. Silas dropped the axe in the dirt and turned to her. She still held the rifle, breath uneven, eyes fixed on the horizon. He reached out, slow, unsure, and placed his hand over hers. "You didn't need me," he said. She shook her head. "No, but I'm glad you stayed." He took the rifle gently, set it aside. And then, for the first time, he touched her face with both hands. No hesitation, no questions. Just a man who had wandered long enough, her breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition. A name she hadn't spoken in years fell from her lips. "Ada," he whispered, as if it were something sacred. She nodded once, eyes full, voice gone. They stood there, between what had almost been lost and what had just been claimed. As the morning light poured over the land, they refused to leave after. The men left. Silence settled over the land like mist. Not the silence of fear, but of breath returned, of something long held being finally released. The days that followed were quiet, not with dread, but with a peace that made every creak of wood and sigh of wind feel sacred. Ada no longer woke before the sun out of habit, but because the dawn had become a kind of prayer. She'd stand outside the barn with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, watching the horizon shift from slate to gold. Some mornings, Silas joined her. Other times, he remained in the field, shirt damp with sweat, planting things no one had asked for: sweetgrass, tobacco, corn. She didn't ask why. She knew those seeds weren't for survival. They were for remembrance. The townspeople began to soften, if only in glances. The preacher nodded once in passing. The girl from the mill brought her an apron stitched with sunflowers. No one spoke of what happened that morning, but the silence had changed. It was no longer isolation. It was space. Room enough to grow. One afternoon, a boy, maybe 10, wandered up from the edge of town. Thin, with a birthmark on his cheek and a mouth too shy for questions. He stood by the garden watching Ada, his small hands tucked into his shirt. She offered him a plum from the tree Silas had planted that spring. He bit into it like it was the first thing he'd ever tasted. Juice ran down his chin, and for a moment, he smiled with his whole face. When he left, he waved, not at her, but at the barn. She realized then that Silas had been watching from the shadow of the doorway, quiet as always. "He yours?" She asked. "No," he said, "but he might come back." That night, she sat beside Silas near the fire, her feet bare, skirt brushing the dirt. The stars hung low, as if listening. She turned to him, rested her head on his shoulder. "I never belonged anywhere," she whispered. He didn't answer with words, just placed her hand over his chest. where his heart beat steady and slow, and that was enough. She began to speak more after that. Not much, but enough for the land to notice. She told Silas the names of the daughters she never had. He carved them into small stones and placed them at the edge of the garden. Not graves, he said. Markers of what could have been. She didn't cry. Just knelt beside the stones and let her fingers trace the letters until dusk. One evening, a sudden rain swept across the plains, soft and warm. She and Silas stood in it, not running for cover, letting it soak their skin and hair. She looked up at him and laughed, sudden and free. "I don't remember the last time I felt this light," she said. "Maybe it wasn't yours to carry," he replied. They slept that night in the barn, the doors open, the scent of rain in the air, and in the morning she found the old saddle, the one her husband had traded her for, broken and half buried behind the shed. Silas had dismantled it, burned what could burn, and used the leather straps to fix the harness of the mule they shared. And no more chains. No more barter, just use. Just purpose. Since that morning, the barn never echoed with silence again. 1https://ppl-web/direct-files/attachments/6986858/eb-953e-4219-83b-14219-83b-148 4F1D3 F3FB/paste.txt